Hello! You have found our weekly study here at the Trumansburg United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Robert Dean, and as we gather together today, we do so as we pass the halfway point in our study of the evangelistic love of God and neighbor by now Bishop Scott Jones. As we have gathered each week, we have looked at one subject on YouTube. That comes out Thursdays. We have looked at another subject on Sunday, and then we've had a conversation time on Saturdays on Zoom. Now this week we're not going to have the conversation time due to some personal conflicts, scheduling wise, but what we are going to do is spend some time Sunday going over a very similar issue. This week we are looking at what it means that Christianity is enculturated, and what that means when we think about how Christianity relates across generations, across cultures and subcultures. So as we gather today, we do so beginning with a word of prayer. This week, our image in our slideshow on our bulletin cover comes from the most beautiful interlochen trail, in this case between Searsburg Road and Totter Lake Pond. Now this particular Teeter Pond? This particular image comes from a wooden path just between the pond and Searsburg Road, the pasture that borders Searsburg Road. And in this particular time when I took this photo, it was before all the recent rains. And now I received the day after I selected these photos, there was a number of storms came through. And I received notice that that particular section was underwater. And so the whole point of sharing this image was to say, what would it be like if it was raining and flooding? But the reality is that this section right now was deluged. That people had to come in and do some assessment work. And this tree that I found across the path, you can't see it very well, but it's only about a foot or two above, was a real impediment to people who needed to use those paths to get around to assess flood damage. And so as I thought about it, my whole point in picking this picture was that sometimes the things we just walk around can be really challenging in other situations. And it also points towards the tendency we have to assume that there are things that, we can just go around that. It shouldn't matter much. But in other situations, other circumstances, other forms of weather, it can be incredibly important. This verse comes from Proverbs 24, and it's actually verses 30 through 34. I passed by the field of one who was lazy, by the vineyard of a stupid person. And see, it was overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. Now, the writer of Proverbs was very opinionated, that's clear, and I'm not sure I'd call someone who maybe has a haphazard farm a lazy person, or a stupid person, but there's some challenges. What the writer of Proverbs is pointing out is that the little things that happen day by day, when you might be wanting to take a little extra rest, a little extra sleep, a little extra slumber, well, if you do that once in a while, that's probably healthy. In fact, that's actually something that God requires us to do, is keep the Sabbath day holy. But if you do it enough, it causes problems. Nettles and thorns growing all over the place, choking out the life of the vineyard. Stone walls broken down so none of the animals will stay, so that wild animals can come in and eat the crops. It could be a really bad situation for a farmer to have a vineyard and have it fall into such disrepair. And yet often, one of the things that Christianity has been complacent in is assuming that everything is just fine. Everything is just normal. And so when culture changes around us, when things slowly start to build up, and we don't adapt, we don't change, we don't work at it, it can become overwhelming to us. And so our prayer for this week is that we would understand the wisdom of books like Proverbs. That we wouldn't necessarily be like those who are blocked on the path by downed trees, but we'd be people who saw that there are challenges and prepared ourselves to either go under, over, or to remove the impediment entirely. We pray, oh God, that we would be wise enough to keep our eyes open, that we would not rest on our laurels to the point where everything starts falling apart, but that we would work and strive and try to live better lives facing our challenges as we come across them. Amen. So as we come into our study this week, there is a word that is at the heart of what we're talking about. And it's not a common word. I looked it up, and it's less than 100 years old. It was first used in sociological, anthropological circles about 1950s. And the word is enculturation. Enculturation is the process by which an individual learns the traditional content of a culture and assimilates its practices and value. So, the process by which an individual learns the traditional content of a culture and assimilates its practice and values. That is something that is really integral to the Christian process. And you might not even realize it. There are verses throughout scriptures that teach us how to live with each other. And one of those verses comes from 1 Corinthians 13. In verses 8 through 11, it says, "Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways." Now, when I was young, I was a very active Christian, especially in my late teens. And one of the things that I absolutely adored was going to places like Kingdom Bound at Darien Lakes, to Christian music festivals where I could hear bands that I was absolutely enthusiastic about. They spoke my language. The rhythm of the drums, the beating of the song, the music was just deep and meaningful. And so when I heard the Christian lyrics coming out with the same kind of sounds that I loved and adored, it really changed my view of what Christianity was. Now, I went to a fairly traditional United Methodist church. We had organs, we had pianos. Yes, we had brass bands and stuff like that, and choirs, and those were important, and bell choirs. But the reality is most Sundays it was piano or organ and hymns. Just time and time again, same songs over and over again. As a child, I sometimes thought that people were missing out on the point by singing the same songs over and over again. Didn't they realize that this awesome new band had sung this brand new song? Wasn't it amazing? And I didn't understand that that was deeply meaningful. The songs that we're singing were deeply meaningful to the people around us. In fact, as an adult now, younger people often, when I'm hanging around with them talking about music, look at my music like I'm some kind of dinosaur. And I'm not incredibly old, I'm not incredibly young, but the reality is that my music has kind of passed away. That is the process of enculturation. The culture around us has adapted the Christian processes by which we believe, and it's expressed itself over and over again. The music of Christianity expressed in ska and in heavy metal when I was a teenager was the same Christianity that expressed itself in bar tunes in the times of the Protestant Reformation, especially the Methodist movements. You know, Charles Wesley used a lot of bar tunes. The same processes were used when people put beautiful music onto the simplest songs that people could learn in songs and hymns and chants throughout the ages. Indeed, over time and time again, Christianity has adopted not only musically but culturally a lot of the practices around us. You know, I may get some flack for this, but Christmas falls right when a lot of other worldly holidays take place. Is that a coincidence? We are pretty sure that Jesus was born in spring, but we celebrate in winter, right when other people celebrate. We are fairly certain that there has been adoption of practices, of songs, of culture throughout time by Christianity. And it happens again and again and again. Bishop Jones says this on page 121. During the 2 millennia of Christianity, the gospel has always been enculturated. One of the hallmarks of Christianity is that it is both capable of being planted in different cultural contexts and in some ways requires that this be done. Now that is an amazing statement. And Bishop Jones goes further to spell out what he means by that in this chapter. We're going to touch on some of that this weekend, but one of the important things to realize here in the midst of everything is that the enculturation that Bishop Jones talks about starts at the very beginning. Indeed, he says that Jesus himself comes into a very Hebrew-centered Judaism that is completely focused. And he preaches in that context, and he reaches out, and he starts even pushing against the religious leaders and allowing that gospel to connect with people outside of the religious elite found in Judaism. From there, it goes out to Jewish people who are Hellenistic or Greek in nature. From there, it goes forth, and it goes forth, and it goes forth time and time again. But it all starts with Jesus, who didn't say, Judaism has these narrow bounds, so I'll only reach out to these folks. But Jesus pressed into the culture around him. He did ministry with those he was around, even when it meant that it was something that caused friction, caused trouble. This happens again and again, and it starts with Jesus, but doesn't end there. There's examples of enculturation throughout Christian history. And we're going to look at some good examples and some bad examples so we can think about, what are some of the positive things that come out of this? Before we even consider, do we need to adapt the culture around us? Do we need to be enculturated again and again and again as a church? Let's look at the history, and that's really what we're doing today. There are some good examples of enculturation that have taken place. These are all in my opinion. And there are definitely different ways of looking at these. And some people may not see them in the same light I do, so I'm going to try to express myself clearly. There were the desert monks in the wilderness. And what I mean by that is when people came to believe in Christianity, there were some of them who were pushed to the outsides, especially as Christianity became the mainstream religion. There were those who wanted to be faithful who began to reach out to the very edges of society. It was believed at the time, and I'm not going to quote the source for this, but I've studied it extensively over years, that the devil was in the wilderness. Where does Jesus go to face the devil? In the wilderness. Where does Legion live? But in a graveyard. So on the edges of society, out where the wilds meet, where death comes itself and is buried on the edge of town, often, especially in Jewish culture, there is this understanding that evil and the devil are there. So the monks decide that is where they're going to go test their faith. So rather than just saying, I can only learn here, I can only learn there, they find themselves necessarily drawn to places where their culture teaches them the devil is, so they can go do battle with their temptation. And in the process, by the way, a lot of them made livings by doing simple things like weaving baskets. They didn't need much, but what they needed they did so by providing for local needs, by weaving baskets, by working in local crafts. And by doing so, the Christianity they preach about often tells a lot about the very nature of living in such a circumstance. They were lonesome, and they were lonely, and they were isolated, and so often they talk about such things, and they value the community they have. They value silence and time with God. This happens again in a different way with the Celtic Christians in monastic communities, especially nowadays. We can still see them in places like Iona. There are these communities that pop up, and rather than being on the edge of town, when they go into these very Celtic communities, the monks actually created their monasteries as they were right in the center of villages, right in the center of town. They worked in and among the crafts of the locals. They obviously did beautiful stonework, but their ministry was right in and among the people. And because those were very community-based cultures, they moved right in there with them. They worked right there with them. They were enculturated rather than accepting the monastic view. that they should be on the edge of the things from desert Christians before, they actually decide to go and live right among the people they're doing ministry with. Enculturation changes their view of community. And as such, there's a lot of Celtic Christianity throughout the years that is based on communal life. If you look at some of the old prayer books of Celtic Christianity, there's a lot of prayers for things like smoring the fire and about living in community in day-to-day life. There's a lot of examples where missionary work with languages has been really enculturated. Not the ones where they come in and say you have to learn English, but the ones where missionaries came in and actually began to learn the culture, learn the language so that they could translate the gospel. As such, there is necessarily an intertwining of the native and inherently aboriginal beliefs and Christianity as it comes into that culture. It is shaped. There are a number of prayers in our hymnal that are based on the Great Spirit. That is a good way of connecting with cultures doing missionary work and how they not only fed those cultures but were fed by them and grew and changed their Christianity as a result. We're going to come back to missionary culture, don't worry. And finally, community building in African American churches. And while nobody is suggesting the slave trade was a good idea, not in the slightest. There is something positive to be said after such a horrific tragedy that should never be repeated and in fact still needs work to heal. There's an incredible beauty in African American churches creating community context of not only sharing the gospel with each other, but creating places for people to work for the common community, to work for their common welfare. The African American church today is still very much a church where people connect and grow as a community. It is integral to those neighborhoods, to those people who are involved in there. And while, clearly I am not African American, even looking in from the outside, it's something that I am sometimes jealous of, those close connections. Born out of tragedy, there are still beautiful things. And I think we see how often in Christian culture, even outside of those circles, we joyfully accept the gift of music. We joyfully accept the gift of wisdom, of words on civil rights, and we joyfully accept leadership, at least today, from those who have a vastly different leadership experience, life experience than we do. I know for my part, I am incredibly jealous of the nature of the community that is there. I see that as a great example of enculturation, where in amidst even the most put upon, poorly treated, clearly misused people, much to the shame of people in my ancestry, there is something beautiful that comes out of the gospel building and growing in those communities over the years. Now, there's some troubling examples, otherwise known as bad examples. One of the things that we learn about Celtic Christianity is at the same time there's a Roman model that is going around a good portion of the Christian world and saying, this is the model by which you should live. These are the things you should do. We see this last for a long time, to the point where within my lifetime I've been to an all-Latin Mass in a culture that didn't necessarily want an all-Latin Mass, but it was just, you went to church and it was led in Latin. And that was very strange. And it was troubling in that it, in some ways, denigrated the local culture. So yes, they were happy to be a part of the culture. They're happy to be there. But rather than be enculturated and learning the culture, at some level, the enculturation that took place was an effort to supplant and remove. In some places, Christianity adapted violence, especially during events like the Crusades, especially during counter-reformations and the attempts to keep kind of a I'm trying to figure out how to say this without using the wrong word, so I won't try. Trying to keep one version of Christianity as the version in certain cultures. The adaptation of violence in those places was awful. Indian schools, in particular, I want to say Methodist Indian schools, because there were many of them, were meant to help cultures, but the way that people separated individuals from families, forced them to speak English, tormented them, punished them for using their native language, those things were not acceptable. So yes, we'll have you in. You can be part of our culture, but if you even speak about these things, you won't. And then there's missionary work with force. The violence, the forcing, the even just the oppression of forms of Christianity that you don't like with violence has been an ongoing troubled part of our relationship as a culture with those around us. So enculturation really is this connection of Christianity to what we believe. And as a result of this, there are great examples where enculturation has done beautiful, powerful, wonderful things, where Christianity has grown and flourished. Indeed, when Bishop Jones says, Christianity almost demands this, we would not be nearly even the slightest bit the faith we are without that ongoing adaptation and learning from cultures around us, for letting their values form us. But we also need to be aware of the fact that sometimes those forms of enculturation can cause those troubling problems, where we have adapted one form of enculturation so hard that when we come across another community, when we come across another group of people, when we come across a different circumstance, we try to force it on others. Like forcing English in Native American classroom, like forcing subservient theology on African American communities, like using Christianity as a justification for subjugation and oppression and enslavement. All these things have come when we have taken one aspect of what we've absorbed from the world around us and taken it in so far that we end up cutting ourselves off from our own belief. There's a difference between adapting to a culture and completely letting go of yourself. I know as a Methodist, I'm proud that we are trying to take steps to rectify some of these ancient, terrible situations, as well as some modern ones, where we're trying to figure out, where does God rest in all of this? But on the other hand, it should be stated the fact that enculturation has happened over and over again. Bishop Jones says this on page 123. On this view, the practice of Christianity among Presbyterians in Dallas, Texas, Pentecostal Methodists in Chile, Greek Orthodox in Beit Sabur, Palestine, Roman Catholics in Poland, Southern Baptists in Georgia, Congregationalists in Massachusetts, and the Church of England in Nigeria are all recognizably Christian. And yet they are working in many different contexts and with many different ways, forms and ways of being Christian. All of these are recognizably Christian, and yet they are working in many different contexts and with many different forms and ways of being Christian. All across the world, Christianity looks different in different places. It really does. It can be strange and weird and wonderful, but Bishop Jones says that these things are all recognizably Christian. What's amazing for me sometimes is the fact that this enculturation process, this process of adapting to people that are different, is often hardest, closest to where we are. And so when we look at, say we go on a mission trip to serve among the Dene, we might look at their way of practicing their faith and say, wow, that's very different, very beautiful. We might go to a church in South Korea and say, wow, these people are on fire for Jesus. This is amazing. They practice things so differently, but so beautifully. We might sit through a communion service in Japan that's very similar to a tea ceremony and say, that's beautiful, that's wonderful. But when it comes to accepting someone who's across the street, someone who maybe just likes a little bit of drum beat with their guitar, or maybe wants a guitar instead of a piano, they both have strings, they both make sound from hitting a metal piece of string with a instrument, whether it be a pick or a hammer. One has 6 strings, yes, one has many more. But the reality is, when it comes to those minor differences, it can be so much harder to accept that enculturated change has occurred or is occurring than to accept something that's radically different. In fact, sometimes I wonder if we don't get along better with people overseas than we do with people next door. And perhaps that is on us to consider and pray about. So as we prepare to go from this place for this week, I invite you to think about, what are some ways that your faith has been enculturated by the world around you? Not to the point where you have lost your faith or become so sucked up into it, but what are some of the basic things in your faith that have affected your life, affected your spiritual life, affected the way you've grown? What are some things you've appreciated over the years? If you were one of those children of the 70s who love the music, was there a folk song that changed your mind, your heart? Perhaps one we still sing at camp. They still get sung at camp sometimes. Is there something, if you were, like me, a child of the 80s, was there something about the music revolution that took place with starting with bands like Stryper, going to people like Five Iron Frenzy, that really changed your viewpoint of the world around us musically? If you're younger, is there something to be said about maybe a digital form of ministry that has affected you and changed the way you lived your life? So once again, my name is Robert Dean. I'm the pastor at the Trumansburg United Methodist Church. We do invite you to join us this Sunday as we go further into these ideas of enculturation and about the gospel. And as we continue to think about what does it mean to share the good news, this Sunday we'll dive into how the change in our culture affects the way we share our gospel. So thank you, God bless you, and we will see you soon.